A young woman reflects on the existence of darkness and light in the world. Man and woman, food, diseases, work, emotions, and feelings as people perceive them. Meanwhile, a man named Michael wakes his casual acquaintance with whom he spent the night and asks her to leave as he cannot sleep beside another person. The woman is taken aback but still gathers her things and leaves. On the other side of town, Susan and her sister Jenny are walking along the seashore. Susan brought Jenny here to throw stones, as it's her way of releasing negative emotions after yet another painful breakup. Later, Michael arrives at work at the restaurant where he is the head chef and stops at the entrance with the owner. Susan's boss, Stephen, meets her and asks her to accompany him to the hospital, where they meet the wife of a sick driver. He called her, talking as usual, then suddenly broke down crying. Afterward, he informed her that he could no longer smell anything. Susan begins questioning the man, who insists he doesn't want to stay in the hospital. He can't smell, but that's not life-threatening, he argues. Stephen later explains that this case is not isolated. Similar incidents are occurring worldwide over the past 24 hours. No one knows how people are getting infected, as they had no direct contact with one another. Suddenly, their patient begins acting aggressively, yet the doctors head home. Meanwhile, there's a rush of guests at Michael's restaurant, and all the kitchen staff struggle to keep up with preparing and serving dishes. In between tasks, he finds time to discuss his personal life with a colleague, asserting he doesn't want to fall in love, as it brings too many troubles. At the same time, Susan walks over to the window and lights a cigarette, which Michael sees as he steps outside. She's on the phone when Michael asks her for a cigarette, and to avoid him disturbing her conversation, she simply tosses the pack out the window. However, Michael also asks for a lighter. Susan throws it down and sarcastically asks if he'd like to spend the night at her place. But Michael laughs, saying he doesn't even know her name. His name, though, is Michael. Susan calls him a sailor and closes the window. Later, Susan and her colleagues discuss the situation, but they still have no ideas about what could be causing it. Stephen suggests treating it as an infection. The carrier could be something added to the water. Meanwhile, the epidemic begins to escalate. All over the world, people suddenly feel the grief of their losses. They cry, remembering those they've lost, and apologize to those they've hurt. This affects everyone, regardless of age. After the fit of grief, people lose their sense of smell. Epidemiologists name the disease SOS, severe olfactory syndrome. Susan tries to understand the nature of this phenomenon and how it spreads, but can't find any answers. Soon, people begin to calm down. Yes, life is harder without smell, but it's manageable. For restaurants, tough times begin as the appeal of any dish lies in its aroma. One day after his colleagues leave on errands, Michael is left alone in the kitchen and notices Susan arriving. She recognizes him and explains that her father called everyone sailors, even though he'd never been on a ship. Now she does the same, though she hated this trait in him. Michael accepts the nickname and offers her a meal since there's a lot of food left in the kitchen. Susan agrees and finds his cooking delicious. She shares about her work but suddenly starts crying, remembering her father. Michael hands her a handkerchief, but she struggles to calm down. She realizes she's probably infected and lets Michael take her home. All evening, she weeps before falling asleep in his arms. But she wakes up to find him crying, and she comforts him as best she can. Morning comes. The depression and tears have passed, along with their sense of smell. They say goodbye, and Michael heads to work, still puzzled by what happened. Susan also goes to the lab, where Stephen suggests that losing the sense of smell might have its advantages. For instance, they no longer smell the odor of rabbit cages. Michael and his colleagues try to figure out how to compensate customers for the inability to enjoy food. They add spices, making dishes spicier, saltier, sweeter, more acidic. Soon people forget the scent of grandmother's kitchen, freshly cut grass, and cow's milk. The smell of gasoline, which held memories of travel, fades away. Without smell, a whole ocean of memories disappears. One day, Michael visits Susan and tells her that the restaurant has reopened. He offers her a cigarette, but she declines. Then he suggests they go for a walk. They can grab some apple pie with coffee. His invitation sounds so tempting that Susan agrees. They walk along the waterfront, and Susan shares that she came to Glasgow to visit her sister and ended up staying. Unexpectedly, they come across a woman with a violin who tells people that scents can be recalled through music. She plays, describing the scents of an autumn forest, branches, and moisture. Down below, moss, mushrooms, fallen leaves. In the middle, tall grass. Up above, the scent of the sky. After this, Michael suggests going to Susan's place, but she fears getting into a relationship. He then proposes just walking her home while he'll follow behind. Susan agrees, finding it amusing. They reach her apartment, where passion overtakes them. Later, lying in bed, Michael regrets not remembering her scent and admits he wants to fall asleep in her arms, though he usually can't sleep beside anyone. Suddenly, Susan asks him to leave. Michael doesn't understand what's happened but dresses and leaves, leaving Susan his card so she can call him. Later, he rides his bike to the cemetery, where he's met by an elderly couple who chide him for coming to their daughter's grave without flowers, as she loved them so much. Elizabeth meets with her sister and shares that her last boyfriend got married in a church properly. Apparently, his fiancée is pregnant. She doesn't know what to say about Michael just yet. Meanwhile, Michael listens to his colleagues chatter, his eyes fixed on Susan's windows, and she reflects that environmental activists are convinced an ecological apocalypse is beginning, caused by pollution and genetically modified foods. Intelligence believes it's an attack on the free world, while fanatics see it as divine punishment. Theories multiply, frightening Earth's population. One day, Stephen has an episode. He screams that unknown forces want to destroy the Earth and convulses in hysteria. He's given a sedative. But when Susan goes to her car after work, she suddenly feels anxious and starts screaming that she can't die alone. A passing woman tries to help her. At this moment, Michael also has an episode. Another chef suddenly starts panicking. The healthy ones try to calm them down, not noticing how they themselves are getting infected. After experiencing a fit of fear, people suddenly feel a ravenous hunger and begin eating everything in front of them. Half-cooked food, sauces and spices, flowers, lipstick, raw meat, and fish. The world goes mad in an instant, trying to satisfy this insatiable urge. It passes as suddenly as it began, and people regain their senses, unable to understand how it happened. They then discover that they've lost their sense of taste. Michael arrives at Susan's place, and she greets him with open arms. They wonder what will happen next. Will people lose all their other senses? Susan notes that smell and taste are connected, so maybe the losses will stop here. But if Susan is wrong, it could mean the end for humanity. In the morning, Susan suggests that Michael go to work, and he asks if he can see her again, which brings a smile to her face. Michael heads to work and sees the doors closed. He's told that restaurants are no longer needed since people can't smell or taste anymore. Now they can eat anything as long as it sustains life. But Michael insists that people will return and drink to each other's health. Meanwhile, the aftermath of the frenzy is being cleaned up everywhere. Life returns to normal, and people try to continue as before. After a few weeks, the sensation of taste becomes distant and forgotten, and other senses take its place. Customers return to restaurants simply to be served and to listen to the clinking of glasses. Now, people evaluate the consistency, temperature, texture, and moisture of dishes. Michael and Susan enjoy each other's company. One day, Michael suggests trying shaving foam because it's so smooth, then follows it up with a bite of soap, which makes Susan laugh and inspires them to taste anything they find interesting. They dance and take pleasure in everything that's still accessible to them. Later, Susan confesses to Michael that she can't have children. He shares that he left a seriously ill girlfriend and now goes to her grave to make himself feel guilty. But now he feels better because he's moved on. However, news soon arrives from Hong Kong of the first cases of hearing loss. This becomes a global catastrophe as it's accompanied by fits of anger and rage, leading to violence. The uninfected have no choice but to wait. One day, Michael pulls out an old Polaroid and takes a photo of them together. Later, the restaurant owner is informed of its closure and is advised to start cooking for the infected, as thousands are in quarantine. He's given a standard menu that any cafeteria could handle. Susan is left without a home, as her entire floor is quarantined. Michael invites her to come with him. On the way, they stop by a church and listen to the sound of bells echoing over the city. Soon they arrive at Michael's apartment and can finally take off their masks. Susan remarks that they've suddenly moved in together and will now live as a couple. Suddenly, Michael starts talking about how they can now enjoy each other whenever they want. He elaborates on the idea, becoming increasingly crude. In the end, he insults Susan with every dirty word he knows, calling her just like everyone else and reminding her that she can't have children. Stunned, Susan watches as he starts to destroy the apartment, then finally runs away. Michael tears down the wallpaper and smashes the furniture. She calls her sister, who admits that she didn't think their relationship would work. Susan cries in her car, watching as people around her go wild, breaking everything in sight. Michael eventually calms down and realizes he can't hear anything anymore. Volunteers advise him to stay home, hang a white sheet in his window, and wait for food and water to be delivered. And so he remains locked up, alone. Meanwhile, Susan goes to the lab, where only Sebastian is left, who also can't hear. Michael still sits at home, occasionally accepting the simple food brought by volunteers. One day, he calls Susan to admit that everything he said was nonsense. He never really thought those things. It was the illness talking. Susan hangs up before he finishes, saying it wasn't him and it wasn't her. Anger overwhelms her, and she yells insults at him, throwing everything in her reach. She doesn't listen to what Michael is saying. He begs her to believe him and come back because he loves her deeply. Afterward, he's left only to watch TV, where the news ticker advises people to stay home and wait until help arrives. Susan regains her composure in the rec lab, realizing that she too has lost her hearing. Sebastian tries to say something, but she can't hear him. Meanwhile, Michael steps outside and sees the destruction around him. Bloodied masks of volunteers lie scattered, but there's no one in sight. He heads to his restaurant and finds the owner, who's trying to tell him something, unaware that Michael can't hear. Susan goes to her sister, who welcomes her and suggests they communicate by writing. Susan admits that she was right about Michael, and Jenny suggests they go throw stones. People now behave in several ways. Some take what they want and live however they please. Others believe the end of the world is near, but there are farmers still milking their cows, soldiers still serving, and chefs still cooking for the sick. They are the ones who believe life will go on. Everyone is learning sign language. Michael's restaurant reopens and Susan cleans up her office, discarding their photograph. The chefs cook for those who communicate with sign language, musicians play from memory, and scientists continue their research. People prepare for the worst, imagining themselves blind, yet hoping for the best. They focus on what matters most to them. Susan finds joy in watching her nieces and nephews play, while Michael stands outside her window, shouting her name, but no one can hear him. People once thought that the Ice Age crept in slowly, starting gradually, but recently they found several mammoths with undigested grass in their stomachs, proving that they froze instantly. Such an avalanche has now descended upon Earth, but it was preceded by moments of happiness, euphoria, and joy. People suddenly felt warmth and love for each other, gratitude for simply being alive. Most of all, they felt an overwhelming desire to be together. Feeling this, Susan rushed to Michael just as he stepped out to meet her and give her his love. They met outside her house, walking toward each other, but just before they could take the final step, everyone lost their sight. Yet they felt each other's warmth and the tears on their cheeks. If anyone could see them, they would think they were just an ordinary couple in love. Because life goes on. There are many pros and cons to this film, but how often do you encounter a film that ends with a tragic happy ending?